Hi everyone, I'm really sorry I'm not there. I really wish I was, but unfortunately I can't be, so I'm sending this video in my place. So I was asked to present the AEPF framing paper on the BRI. So this framing paper emerged from two workshops, one in Ghent and one in Amsterdam. And what we sought to do was develop a framing of the BRI, an analysis that could be helpful in other AEPF work on the BRI. So what we did was we took a bit of a different perspective. We looked at the BRI more through a political economy lens. And what we found is rather than viewing the BRI as a planned strategy, as a grand strategy, we're viewing it more as a broad and loosely governed framework of activities that seek to address a crisis in Chinese capitalism. So we're seeing the BRI as being rooted in this crisis in Chinese capitalism and viewing the BRI more as a spatial fix. So spatial fix is a concept developed by David Harvey. So looking at it within the Chinese context, so since transitioning to an export-orientated industrialization model in the 1980s, China has experienced several cycles of crises and fixes. So routinely in this model of production, it produces surpluses of capital and capacity. So to resolve these surpluses in capital and capacity, new opportunities must be found to combine that capital and capacity in a way that's productive and profitable. So this is often done through boosting trade and investment and building infrastructure. So this is not a problem that's unique to China. It's something that has occurred throughout history and in capitalist countries across the world, including the US and in Europe. But if this crisis is not resolved, it can lead to high unemployment and unrest, which is something that the Chinese government, like all governments, fears. So this model of export-orientated industrialization was first implemented in Southeast China. And as these surpluses in capital and capacity appeared in the 1990s, Chinese companies began moving westward and abroad to find more profitable projects. At the same time, Chinese provincial governments were seeking to mimic the growth on the East Coast in their own provinces and began encouraging these companies to come and invest in their provinces. So in 2001, the Central Chinese government launched two policies that encompassed and encouraged these activities that were already going on. So one policy was the Great Western Development Project, which was more domestic, and the second was going out. So these policies were very broad, kind of slogan-based, very broad policies to encourage investment and industrialization in the West, and then in western part of China, and also encourage Chinese companies to go abroad and operate abroad. This campaign-style mobilization is common in Chinese economic policy. So rather than kind of a top-down dominant planning, provincial governments and companies have a lot of freedom in how they implement these broad policies. So they can use these policies, these slogans, to promote their own projects and push forward their own agendas, while the central government appears to be in control. So they, through this kind of broad policies, appear that they are leading the way and have a sense of leadership. So despite these attempted fixes in the early 2000s, the same problems continue to emerge. And this was especially the case after the global financial crisis. So after a massive bailout that was based on loans from the central Chinese government, many of the provincial governments were in a huge amount of debt. Yunnan, for example, couldn't repay their loans on highways. At the same time, there was overcapacity in state-owned enterprises in construction, in housing, in energy, and that needed to go somewhere. Likewise, going out had been hit by scandals. So particularly Chinese companies operating abroad were accused of corruption, poor quality projects, using Chinese workers, a whole raft of scandals. So what the Chinese government did in 2013 was essentially repackage the activities that were already occurring under Going Out and Great Western Development Project and the same approaches and then repackage them under the BRI. So the framework of the BRI is incredibly broad. So despite being about $1 trillion initiative, the main policy document is about 10 pages long, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. So with this broad framework, they learnt from Great Western Development Project and Going Out. And they learned from these the importance of building political and public support for Chinese investments abroad. So there are 5 key priority areas within the BRI. And the first, policy coordination, really focuses on building this political support. So under policy coordination includes things like government to government meetings at all levels, and is about coordinating policy that affects multiple countries, but also building that political support. The second priority area is infrastructure connectivity. So this is about higher quality infrastructure that moves goods, people, and information faster and cheaper. But infrastructure also is a way to absorb this excess capacity and capital in itself, the building of that infrastructure. The third priority area is described in the Chinese version of the policy document as free-flowing trade and investment, and it's described as the key substance of the BRI. So the idea that free-flowing trade and investment could be in any sector. So it could be in mining, tourism, agriculture, education, any sort of sector that generates a profit. And this is really about what the core of the BRI is facilitating. It is for companies and to boost trade and investment for profit effectively. The fourth one is financial integration. So this is about building the financial infrastructure necessary to move money across countries and the policies necessary for that, but also financing these massive projects. And there's an agenda within the Chinese central bank that they would like the renminbi, the Chinese currency, to be the reserve currency of the world in the way that the US dollar functions today. The fifth one is incredibly broad. It's called Closer People to People's Bonds. But the Chinese version includes the characters that are included in hearts and minds. So this one is really about building popular support for the BRI, for Chinese investment and trade. And this could be anything from traditional aid and development activities to research, to education exchanges, study tours, party-to-party exchanges, including any party, including the far right, if they will talk to them. So basically, it's any activity that could occur between different peoples. So that's incredibly broad. So basically, with this huge, broad framework, you could effectively count any activity in any place and by any actor. So even if a country hasn't signed on, an activity still can occur in that country. So for example, Germany hasn't signed on to the BRI and is fairly ambivalent to it, but the Deutsche Bahn, the German National Railway, is involved in a major BRI project to connect China and Europe via rail. Likewise, America is anti the BRI, but this huge American company, General Electric, is investing in BRI projects, branding projects as BRI, where they involve other Chinese companies. So even though a country hasn't signed on, it doesn't stop local capital from engaging with the BRI. And the BRI here also factors like a branding mechanism. So there is no official list of BRI projects. There is no official map. In fact, maps of the BRI are banned in China. So it means that any actor, anywhere, can brand their project as a BRI project. There's not an official process to become a BRI project. There is, however, with some sub-elements of the BRI, for example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor or the Myanmar-China Economic Corridor, these kind of sub-projects often have their own lists of projects. So there will be, there's a list of projects that are included under the Chinese-Myanmar Economic Corridor. But to brand something BRI, there isn't really a process to come up with that, nor is there a list of what is and what isn't BRI, which means anyone can brand pretty much anything in any place as BRI. So you could even brand this meeting as a BRI meeting if you would like to. So why do companies want this BRI branding? Well, the branding can help naming something a BRI project can help get funding within China, and it can help to build political support, but also prestige can come from making a project in some part of the world part of a global initiative. So people are also using that to promote their own projects. So under this broad framework, there's basically an infinite amount of projects that could be branded as BRI. And the Chinese government doesn't necessarily know about all of these. So in Myanmar, for example, there's been a case in Shui Koko where a company that has strong links to organized crime and is very, very dubious has branded their own project as BRI. And we're not even sure if the Chinese government knew about that project until the scandal hit the media. But because you can label it BRI, it's then very difficult for the Chinese government to control the BRI brand and to avoid these scandals. So in terms of the governance of BRI, there's 12 agencies involved. There is a core office that's called the Office for the Leading Group for Promoting the Belt and Road Initiative, which is part of the National Development and Reform Commission. But their role is more the promotion of the initiative rather than the governance. So of these 12 agencies involved, some of them have oversight of state-owned enterprises. So Chinese state-owned enterprises are the ones who are rolling out most of the big BRI projects. And basically since the 1980s, these state-owned enterprises have undergone a process of corporatization. So then there are now only 97 central government state-owned enterprises and 100,000 provincial level state-owned enterprises. And some of these companies are huge. So the largest has an annual revenue of $414 billion. Some of their CEOs have ministerial rank, which means they're quite powerful within the hierarchy of the central Chinese government bureaucracy. But so basically these state-owned enterprises, their success or failure since they've been corporatized is measured on profit and revenue and other economic indicators. And then there's a body at the central government level called SASAC, which is responsible for oversight of these state-owned enterprises. But they're quite weak. They lack the capacity, they lack the information to really understand and assess and provide effective oversight of these state-owned enterprises. So CEOs basically have complete freedom or a great deal of freedom in how they operate these huge state-owned enterprises. And this is even more so at the provincial level. So the provincial level, these 110,000 state-owned enterprises, some are now acting more and more operating abroad, but the provincial governments lack the information and understanding of what's going on in Africa or Latin America, and lack the capacity to give oversight of these enterprises in these places that are very far away and very different. So what this basically means is there's the governance structure of the BRI is quite weak. And so for there to be effective oversight of BRI projects to the extent that we would expect, the oversight really needs to come from the countries where the projects are being implemented. And of course, this is very difficult, we know, but it will be important in how the BRI projects and the initiative progresses. So that's the BRI, but it's really important we look at the BRI in the context of broader trends. So we've identified a couple in the paper. So first of all, the BRI is occurring in a particular moment in globalization. So we talk about this as the age of extreme infrastructure. So this is an age of mega corridors in which mega extraction, mega consumption, and mega production is being facilitated by mega infrastructure. So the aim is to move people, goods, and information quicker and cheaper for maximum profit. So BRI is promoting this model, but it's not the only promoter of this model. The ADB has been promoting this for a long time, and likewise the EU. But we know how damaging this corridor model can be, and we've seen this damage particularly in Southeast Asia. So it's a really concerning and really disturbing trend that the BRI is exacerbating and is part of in this age of extreme infrastructure. So second, BRI is emerging in an age of bilateralism. So there's more focus with Trump, with Brexit, there's more focus on the bilateral level nowadays. And this is also how BRI, the kind of big negotiations are occurring. The negotiations for MOUs for involvement officially in the BRI is occurring. So this follows a broader international trend of bilateralism. At the same time, there's been some people have argued that China is attempting to overthrow the international system. I would disagree with that. I think rather they're trying to use the international system, particularly UN agencies, to promote the BRI and to legitimate the BRI through those institutions. Another trend is the trend of using public-private partnerships. So Chinese companies Chinese state-owned enterprises have really tapped into this, and they're acting as the private, both domestically in China and internationally in public-private partnerships. But we know how damaging these partnerships are, where the companies take all the profit and the governments are left with all the risk. So even though we're viewing the BRI more as kind of rooted in economic concerns, it does still have geopolitical consequences. So other countries have viewed the BRI as a thinly veiled attempt to expand China's influence. So some countries have been supportive, like Russia, while others like Japan, India, US, and Australia have been strongly against and have launched their own development initiatives in response. The BRI, under this initiative, the pursuing trade and investment and an increase in trade and investment between countries in this way is likely to exacerbate the asymmetry in trade and investment and the asymmetry in economic power between countries that often exist between China and their trading partners. And this can create dependency. So I think the issue of debt trap often comes up, and personally looking at the data available on the cases related to where the debt trap argument has been made, I don't talk so much about debt trap. I believe what's happening more is debt burden. So these projects are creating a huge debt burden on governments that will make it very difficult for them to repay, and ultimately it'll be the taxpayers who pay in the long term. And that's something that is, of course, of huge concern. At the same time, some countries have actually used the BRI as a leverage against other countries. So we see this a bit more in Europe, where countries in Eastern Europe in particular have used engagement with China and the BRI as a way to leverage against EU influence. Likewise, in countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, they've been able to use Chinese investment to offset the effect of economic consequences from human rights abuses, from mass violence and persecution. So this is really disturbing, and this is a way that BRI has been used by different countries. So some countries are looking at China and at the economic success within China and seeing this as inspiration, but also looking at the political system within China and seeing this as another way. And I think this is something that's, hugely disturbing. Something else that often arises is that there's a view in China that economic progress will bring political stability. And what we see more often is that capitalist expansion brings conflict. We've seen this across the world and throughout history. But this is often a very prominent idea and something that's attractive to some of these governments. So in terms of the BRI projects themselves, a lot of it depends on local context. They are negotiated, these projects vary greatly depending on the local context and the types of projects that are most profitable and most attractive in different countries. At the same time, the Chinese government cannot force a project to go ahead. They need the consent or at least some sort of support from the local national governments for these projects to be approved, to go through, that sort of thing. And all of this negotiation about what projects go ahead, what don't, all of that is mediated through the existing balance of class forces in these countries. And so you have different elites struggling to produce projects that will favour them or not favour their opposition, that sort of thing. So what we've seen in terms of the reaction of local capital is that it's been very varied. In some countries, local capital has really supported the BRI and sought to profit from it, and in others, it's been completely rejected. What we've also seen locally is we've already seen the devastating negative impacts of some of these projects, environmentally, socially, economically, and that seems to be only increasing despite attempts by the Chinese government to have a green BRI. So far, this has been a lot of resource grabbing, forced displacement, those sorts of issues, the issues we see with big investment across the world. Lastly, the Chinese corporations have also been willing to invest in conflict zones that have been deemed too risky by other companies. So places in Africa, in Kashmir, in other areas where other companies have not invested. And so back to that view that economic growth can bring political stability. But in reality, these are inflaming local tensions and exacerbating issues around these conflicts. That is in each location is different, but is really disturbing. So the last thing I want to draw attention to is that Chinese investment is often racialized. So there's a tendency with Chinese investment not to name the company, but to say the Chinese, or in a way that we don't often talk about other companies. So Shell, for example, we never say the Dutch in the way that Chinese companies are often talked about. And I think part of that is we don't often use the names of Chinese companies. So when we looked at this framing, we felt it really important that we take an anti-racist stance in this analysis of the BRI and in our work on the BRI as AEPF, that we make sure, this is capital. This is what happens. And we don't racialize that. And I think that's really important in both how we talk about the BRI, but how we talk about, how we basically respond to the BRI. So that's kind of a summary of the AEPF framing paper. There's a lot in there. It's actually only 7 pages long, so please have a read of it. I'm hoping to join for questions. If that doesn't work, I'm always available on email or any other ways, and my colleagues there can also answer questions. So I hope you all have a great meeting, and I hope that there's some really great things to come out of this meeting. Thanks.